All right, good afternoon, students. It is good to see you here from my home office. I hope that your viewing of the solar eclipse was less disappointing than mine was with this cloudy and rainy day here in Baton Rouge. That said, today we're going to cover chapters 9 and 10 of James Joyce's Ulysses, giving the lion's share of time to the monstrous Scylla and Charybdis, chapter 9, and giving something of short shrift to the mini-sectioned chapter 10, Wandering Rocks, an interesting chapter that itself features a place not gone to in Homer's Odyssey. So perhaps James Joyce is invoking the epic convention of moving beyond that which his predecessor did, and increasing the scope of an epic work of literature, as it were. Well, so if you're following along with the lecture slides too, please follow along on slides 21 to 25. Okay, starting at 21 here. Chapter 9, Scylla and Charybdis, 2 p.m. This is a Stephen chapter. Remember that the chapters have been alternating since chapter 7 or so. We had the first 3 chapters featuring Stephen, the next 3 chapters, chapters 4 through 6, featuring Bloom. 7 was something of an intermezzo. We saw both of them. And then again, 8 in the Laestrygonians, we saw Bloom and learned about his fastidious eating habits and his like of moral pubs and his dislike of unclean, unsober, intemperate eating. So now we find ourselves with Stephen again in chapter 9 in the National Library. To begin, Urbane, to comfort them, the Quaker librarian purred, and we have we not, those priceless pages of Wilhelm Meister. This is for some reference to one of 2 works concerning Wilhelm Meister that our friend Goethe wrote. So I may have mentioned these when I mentioned the text that he wrote in the introduction to Goethe and his Faust, but we have a couple mentions of him in this chapter and even get his opinion on Shakespeare. Goethe was a major fan of Shakespeare and also a major translator of Shakespeare into German as well. A great poet, I continue to quote, on a great brother poet, a hesitating soul taking arms against a sea of troubles, torn by conflicting doubts as one sees in real life. This might be a strong description of the state of our young poet, Stephen Daedalus' soul in some way, right? A hesitating soul, the same way that he hesitated even in his thought to save a drowned person, hesitated to pray over his mother while she was dying, experiences a sea of troubles, like when he was on Sandy Mount Strand, looking over the sea. In chapter 3, during Proteus, conflicting doubts. What is he to do with himself? Be a newspaperman, continue to teach history, join the Irish revivalist movement, which we'll hear today, or even be a singer. He has a singing teacher, and he's apparently, like Molly, a fairly gifted singer. Well, Scylla and Charybdis, let's say a little bit about them from the Odyssey. Scylla and Charybdis are legendary monsters who occupy opposing sides of a narrow strait. Why go through this strait at all, you may ask? Well, the only other passage, mythologically speaking, is through the so-called Wandering Rocks, which chapter 10 is named for in this Ulysses, which destroy all who pass through except for the divine Argonauts who came from the generation before those who sacked Troy. And so the Wandering Rocks are a no-go. One cannot get through them. One must be fated to get through them. And apparently the Argonauts were, but Odysseus was not. And so one ought not to even attempt to go through those. Circe counsels Odysseus. And so he's left with the only other option he has, which is to go through Scylla, which is a 6-headed monster with dogs as a belt that create supposedly a creepy dog yelping sound before she attacks out in the middle of the sea, of all places. She has 6 heads, 3 rows of jaws in each head, and can kill 6 sailors at a time, which she does in the Odyssey. And if sailors don't move fast enough, she'll do it again. And so she can multiply the damage that she does. Charybdis, also gendered female, as it were, is a whirlpool, sometimes represented as something which causes a whirlpool with some sort of gigantic mouth. This is how I think Sea of Monsters, the Percy Jackson movie film adaptation, represented Charybdis. I thought it was a fair, even though I didn't see the movie, I did see that representation. I thought it was a fairly creepy way of doing Charybdis. I think they were moving either shark's fins or teeth within it as well. There's something like a sarlacc pit, though instead of in sand, obviously in ocean. And Charybdis, in being a whirlpool, sucks down all of the ocean surrounding her at once, including any ships. And she does this 3 times a day. A question that I've often been asked by students is, does one know the time that she sucks down the salt sea and the diameter or her radius? And does one know for how long she does suck down the salt sea? And the answer has to be no to all of these questions. Part of the danger of Charybdis in trying to pass her is that one must assume a certain stochastic element or random element in Charybdis's swallowing. And so a leader either has to take the rational decision to guaranteed lose some people to Scylla. And keep in mind, this is a single deck ship that Odysseus is on, so he can't hide. He arms himself, but he is also at risk in going by Scylla. But with Charybdis, everybody is certainly at risk, and the entire game can be lost all at once. The journey can come to a complete end, as it were. And so generally, Scylla is considered the safer bet, and that is the monster that Odysseus goes by while he still has a ship. He will return back by both Scylla and Charybdis and have to face Charybdis, though this time he will only be on a raft and will hang from I believe, fig tree, while Charybdis attempts to suck down the salt sea. So he, unlike his crewmates, ends up facing and defeating both Scylla and Charybdis. And that is the mythological precedent for the chapter that we find ourselves in now with Stephen at the National Library of all places. So what about this chapter makes it worthy of the name Scylla and Charybdis? And I suppose I should also mention that this is, of course, the famous chapter which we've been building up to, diametrically in the middle of this text, chapter 9 of 18, where Stephen finally gives his theory of Hamlet, which we heard Haynes so eager to see earlier. And in fact, he'll miss it, unfortunately for him. But one will see how bent out of shape he is about that. So what is it about this chapter that makes it worthy of the title Scylla and Charybdis? It seems as if our character Stephen must sail between sail straight between two dangerous threats, with no perfect option. So let's keep that in mind before we answer it, and we'll attempt to answer that throughout the course of the lecture, and certainly by the end of our analysis of this chapter. What is Stephen doing at the National Library? Why is he going there? Well, in the same way that, or for the same reason that he ventured to the Telegraph earlier, he is dropping off one of Mr. Vesey's letters on hoof and mouth disease. And in so doing this and delivering to the Freeman's Journal, he's doing low-level literary work. He's delivering the message of another person. He's being a courier person. And notice again that this is time that he could be spending attempting to create art. So in the same way that his teaching is a distraction, his getting drunk later is a distraction, so is even the seemingly good courier Hermes-like duty, something that takes his time away. Something interesting said in this chapter that I think is also undergirding it by Mr. Best is that our national epic has yet to be written. Dr. Sigerson says, this is part of the quote as well. And so something that we know Stephen desires to do is to write something like a national epic, something to compete with Don Quixote, which is referenced in this chapter. And insofar as he gives his time to other endeavors, he will be falling into the trap of Charybdis, the whirlpool that sucks away all that one has. So instead of one's body in this case, it would be, say, one's time. And so we'll get Stephen's theory of Shakespeare as a theory of literary begetting or of fatherhood here. And this will, of course, connect to his budding relationship with Bloom, who has already taken an interest in him. We'll also see a sort of misanalysis or disanalysis of Bloom and Stephen's budding relationship by typically off base and boisterous Buck Mulligan, who is invited to a literary party later alongside Haynes, but not with Stephen, who is the greatest literateur of the bunch. We know also that Bloom has eaten his lunch in the Laestrygonians chapter, and Stephen finally notices Bloom as he appears in the library to copy an advertisement. Buck Mulligan has preceded Bloom and has claimed that he saw Bloom in the National Gallery, and typically in typical Buck Mulligan fashion, he noticed Bloom doing something somewhat sordid. Bloom, in his curiosity, perhaps urbane, perhaps erotic, is checking out what Buck Mulligan describes as the Maycial groove of who he also describes as Venus Callipygae. Kalos means fine in Greek. Pige means rump or buttocks. It's actually a loan word, supposedly. I looked this up in the TLG, the largest Greek lexicon that I have access to. And the Maycial groove is, of course, the crack of the anus. And so he was looking to see just how anatomically accurate these sculptures were. I don't know that we get we get an answer to this, but I would imagine not perfectly anatomically accurate. In any case, Mulligan says a couple other interesting things about Bloom. If I quote, first he calls him the Sheeny. This is a derogatory way of referring to a Jewish person. So this is, again, another moment when one of the citizens of Dublin identifies Bloom, or I should say, defines Bloom by means of his identity rather than his character, or observes and articulates what his identity is, and a negative perception of his character through a negative or pejorative way of expressing his identity without looking at his actions. And then also, of course, asserting that he was doing something somewhat sordid in the National Gallery. And then Buck Mulligan goes on to say, he knows you. He knows your old fellow, that's Simon Dedalus. They were in a carriage together. It's true. I fear me he is Greeker than the Greeks. The pale Galilean eyes were upon her Maycial groove, Venus Callipygae, oh, the thunder of those loins. Something interesting about him saying Greeker than the Greeks. It's a well-known fact about the Greeks. It's something one encounters fairly often in Platonic dialogues, particularly in ones like the Symposium and the Phaedrus. One encounters the notion of pederasty. This is a Greek word, Greek compound word, excuse me. Paidos or pais, which is where paideia comes from too, which is an idea of education. It means young person, and also, excuse me, just moving my cursor so that I can see this. Yes, and Erastos, of course, means beloved. So it means so something like boy lover, and young person lover, but it would have been boys in that case. And so, what is Buck Mulligan saying about Bloom and why he might cast his eyes onto Stephen? Well, he's suggesting that he is doing so homosexually. And in fact, there will be indication later that it is perhaps Buck Mulligan that has such feelings and casts such eyes upon Stephen, or at least Stephen will think so, potentially think so. And so this may very well be an instance of either romantic competition between Buck Mulligan and Bloom, or he is projecting his own feelings onto Bloom, whom we know through dramatic irony is actually feeling far more fatherly towards Stephen than he is feeling pederastically towards him. And so Buck, again, misses the mark, but sort of perfidiously attempts to put a negative stereotyped idea into Stephen's mind in order to prevent him from seeing Bloom for whom he is, or for who he is. In any case, in terms of Scylla and Charybdis, Bloom sails between Stephen's intellectualism, which hasn't gotten him very far so far, and Buck's overbearing embracing of pleasure and drunkenness. So in the same way that Stephen must brave Scylla and Charybdis, it seems as if Bloom must too, though he's already seemingly successfully done this. He, in his practical, intelligent way, with his sort of subtle sensualism, has effectively built a life in which he gets the things that he wants. Even the missing romantic element he's getting from his written correspondence with Martha Clifford currently, as well as I've mentioned many times, when he has the chance to ogle ladies, which he does in the street next to, was it McCoy? Yes. And then later with Gertie McDowell. But he has managed to make a life for himself. His family person, family man, had a son, unfortunately died in 11 days, has a daughter, though a watered down version of Molly. Millie is his daughter, and he has had her, and has, as far as we can tell, successful career that does not require that he ever take out loans from the local loan shark, which we learned from Martin Cunningham in the Hades chapter. And so that which Bloom has done, Stephen is going to have to figure out how to do for himself. Well, let's see if he can continue to navigate. So let's move on to considering what connects Stephen to Hamlet. In Hamlet, King Hamlet Sr. has died, sometimes called Old Hamlet, and his brother King Claudius has usurped his throne, his wife, and his family. Now his nephew is his adopted son, Hamlet. And Hamlet gets to come back from studying at university in Denmark in order to learn this. Or rather, wherever it is that he is studying, he returns to Denmark. There's something rotten in the state of Denmark, as it were. After the usurpation of the throne and the return of Hamlet, the ghost of King Hamlet, appears to young Hamlet back from Denmark and tells him that Claudius is responsible for his death. Hamlet goes on to attempt to confirm what the ghost says, while also overcoming his own curious resistance to action during the course of the play. In fact, he ends up putting on a play within a play and making the famous and giving the famous quote eventually when his mother continues to comment on the play. Methinks the lady doth protest too much. A very interesting bit of pre-Freudianism there. All right. Hamlet goes on to confirm what the ghost says. Shakespeare also shows Stephen a middle way between the world of hard facts, the newspaper, and the world of sentimentality represented by the Irish literary revival. And he runs into several of these revivalists in the library and has a conversation with them. In particular, these Irish revivalists want to restore and rejuvenate the Irish language and what they consider traditional Irish culture. And notice that this has become less essential to the Irish who are alive at the time of Stephen Dedalus. Even the old Irish milk lady doesn't understand Irish. She thinks it's French when she's spoken to by Haynes. And it's only individuals like Haynes, it seems, that do speak Irish. So no longer has the status of really a living language, but is far more like Latin, and has become something of a a curiosity or a language that is learned by the educated who wish to study another people, but is not in fact learned natively by a people. And so figures in this movement were so-called A.E. Russell. His name is George Russell, but he went by A.E. Russell. He's figured in this chapter. William Butler Yeats, I think, is the most famous of the poets who were involved with this. And in fact, we learn a small detail about Russell here, that he's assembling a collection of poems, but he has not asked Stephen to contribute to these poems. In real life, he had already done this. The same Russell, who's figured here, and Joyce had not been asked to contribute a poem either. Stephen is also not invited to George Moore's party later, though Buckingham's are. This says something about the perspicacity of these literary figures, though they may propagandistically wish to bring about a rejuvenation or revitalization or a renaissance of what they consider Irish culture. The person who will actually represent and in some ways rejuvenate Irish culture and by showing it for what it really is right in front of them. The figure of James Joyce, Stephen Daedalus. And of course, some things we will have noticed about Ulysses already is that it's obviously written in English. Very difficult to understand English. But it is not written in Irish, and yet it is a great Irish epic. And so Ulysses takes more of a descriptive stand on what the Irish are in 1904 rather than a normative stand. Joyce represents the people as they are, with all of their various flaws and bodily appendages, and also bodily acts like using the restroom or committing onanism or having an affair and leaving crumbs in the bed. All these little realistic modernist details are included in the text. Well, so, and it happens to be that these revivalists do not recognize the genius of the person who represents James Joyce, who will go on to make this masterpiece, or what we are currently considering whether it is masterpiece or not. All right, why is it that Stephen is interested in Shakespeare? Well, first, there's a reference to Shakespeare by Goethe, which was shared early in the chapter, the Wilhelm Meister. Excuse me, sorry, this is a different reference. The Wilhelm Meister one just begins the chapter, but also Mallarmé too. Also, Eglinton, a character there, says Ireland needs its own epic, its own Don Quixote is used as an example. Shakespeare is an example of the English epic maker, though he doesn't make an epic. It is Milton, mentioned earlier with his Lycidas, who writes Paradise Lost in English and has an English epic. And I do consider that the great English epic, which was written with a religious theme rather than an Arthurian theme, likely because of Milton's dashed political ambitions after the Restoration. But Shakespeare is still considered the greater English writer than Milton, and sometimes the greatest writer, even though he was not an epic poet, and often wrote in dramatic tragic form, also romances, also comedies, and a couple long poems, one of which, Venus and Adonis, we will talk about a little bit later, which I think in fact was written during a 2-year-long plague. One of his 2 long poems was, and his life, like our lives during COVID-19, was interrupted for 2 years. But I digress. In the same way that Shakespeare seems to be the English, the poet of the English soul, so does Cervantes seem to be poet, or the writer of the Spanish soul. And so, just given earlier, we might say that Homer is the writer or singer of the archaic and then later ancient Greek soul. Stephen must be interested in Shakespeare for at least 3 reasons. He wishes to do for Ireland what Shakespeare does for England. Second reason is that Shakespeare has colonized the mind of Stephen in the same way that Roman Catholicism has, in the same way that Stephen knows Latin, and so much that he does about Catholicism, though he is a secular atheist, so does he know English and the poetry and the drama of Shakespeare because of the colonization of both the English nation and the English language in Ireland. So Stephen is himself a person who is a product of two languages and cultures that have been imposed upon him, and two of his major languages, Latin, and which he reads so frequently, and English. And often the Latin, he's reading that which is of great importance to him, religious texts and also commentary on those texts by figures like St. Augustine and Thomas Aquinas as well. And so Stephen has to be interested in Shakespeare because of the scope of his project, because of the language that he speaks, and because of his necessary influence on any writer and necessary absorption by any writer that wishes to be great after him, particularly one that occupies the same political unity as Shakespeare. Though Ireland is its own place with its own customs and language, traditionally speaking, it is part of larger Britannia, which is a political unit that itself encompasses Wales, England, Ireland, and Scotland. Not all of Ireland, though. So what is Stephen's famous theory of Hamlet? There are going to be details that I mention, or I will certainly mention details, but I'll miss some as well. But I'm going to give my best shot to give a general overview of it. And if we want to get into the details, we can get into the details in a less virtual class. So first and foremost, Stephen wants to avoid formless spiritual essences. There seems to be something of a Platonism going on in this chapter. Platonism puts forward, rudely speaking, the idea that there's a world of the forms where all that is ideal exists, something like the good, the just, the beautiful, and we judge all that is good or bad, beautiful or ugly, by how much of the form these things in this world partake of. So formless spiritual essences, or to just partake, or just to view formless spiritual essences, is to try and look into the world of metaphysics, or into a world that informs our world but is not connected to it at the deepest level. One needs to embody a form in this world to bring it truly into existence in this world. And thus one brings beauty, insofar as one can embody beauty, into existence to the extent that one embodies the form of beauty. And so the more beautiful one is, the more one embodies such a form. But that form only exists in this reality insofar as it's embodied. And so Stephen is not going to be comfortable or happy or satisfied simply considering Shakespeare as some brilliant poet. He must serve as an example in some way for Stephen's own actions. Stephen wishes himself to bring something about in the world, not just to enjoy that which has already been brought about, like these revivalists are in danger of doing. Stephen suggests that the ghost at the beginning of the story, the ghost of old Hamlet, is the key to the story of the play Hamlet, the tragedy Hamlet. And though Shakespeare was obviously alive when he wrote Hamlet, Stephen claims that he was a ghost by absence. He was absent from his home and his wife, Anne Hathaway, who was 8 years his senior, and I believe had something of a shotgun wedding with him, or at least that's Stephen's perception. Shotgun wedding, of course, meaning that young William Shakespeare had impregnated Anne Hathaway and was marrying her as a result of that. He had not waited to marry to impregnate her. And so he has to leave home after this marriage in order to make money and to write his plays. And he's gone for many years. In fact, he lived and worked for 20 years in London, away from his home and wife in Stratford. Stephen imagines Shakespeare thus himself playing the ghost of old Hamlet in the first production of the play. I suppose Hamlet was probably Richard Burbage or Babbage, a very famous actor in the troupe of Shakespeare. I hope I got that name right. If I didn't, I'll certainly correct myself in the next lecture. Playing the ghost and addressing Hamlet, Shakespeare speaks to the son of his soul. And so Shakespeare has written Hamlet, and therefore Hamlet, the character, is just as much his son as he is the character in the plays, Old Hamlet's son, too. He is his own spiritual production. And the same way that Mina Purefoy, or excuse me, analogically, like how Mina Purefoy is undergoing labor, childbearing, so does Shakespeare undergo or use his labor to produce Hamlet. And so there's an analogous relationship between labor and production and childbearing there that Stephen is trying to curse a bit. And so Shakespeare speaks to the son of his soul, Hamlet, the character he created, and the son of his body, a boy named Hamnet, who actually died at the age of 11. So there's some speculation that the character Hamlet is to some extent related to Hamlet because etymologically, linguistically, their names sound very similar. Something we notice there too is the 11. In the same way that young Rudy, son of Bloom, only lived 11 days, the son of Shakespeare sadly lived 11 years, perhaps even more sad, or sadder, excuse me, because of how much time Shakespeare had to learn to love him, though I doubt he would have seen him that much given his time in London. In any case, something well worth considering with an exclusive Shakespeare scholar. Stephen also wildly stretches the facts about Shakespeare's life and doubts his own argument, but feels condemned to pursue it. In fact, when he's asked whether he believes what he is saying at the end, he says no, and is asked why anybody else should believe it then. And this is an interesting moment for him, that he thinks that his literary claim to fame is making an argument that he does not believe in. Perhaps this is something of a representation of his secularism and his ability to represent theological points too, which we will see on display during the Nighttown episode when he gets wildly drunk. He's one of those rare characters who becomes, though perhaps less coherent, more articulate while drinking. That said, he is of course character in the story, so perhaps this is a bit of fiction. In any case, his argument leads him to a Shakespeare who looks very much like Ulysses on the one hand and Bloom on the other. Bloom, Ulysses, and Shakespeare each leave his own home and wife and eventually return. Bloom at the end of the night, really the early morning, Ulysses after 20 years away, and Shakespeare after many years away in London, 20 years. All three wanderers also suspect their wives of infidelity during their absence. Bloom will be correct to do so. Ulysses not in the actual text of the Odyssey, though there are some alternative accounts in which Amphinomus or Antinous do manage to lay with Penelope, though those are, of course, alternative accounts. And Shakespeare, one wonders, though I do not personally know whether she was unfaithful. But Shakespeare's son, as I said, died 11. So further connections. Shakespeare's son died at 11 years of age. Bloom's Rudy died at the age of 11 days. Like Bloom, Shakespeare had, according to Stephen, not only an adulterous wife, but also a dead father and a living daughter. And Shakespeare addresses Hamlet as the grown-up version of his dead son, Hamnet. This also, according to Stephen, Bloom links Stephen with the boy that little Rudy might have become. So this is very interesting. And in the same way that Bloom comes to represent a father figure for Stephen, Stephen starts to represent a son figure for Bloom. So just as Ulysses returns 20 years after having had his son, not to a child, he's missed all of his son's childhood, but to a man who is his son, and he learns and knows to be a son because of Athena and certain resemblances, but might just as well be a stranger to him. So does Bloom start to see his son in a stranger, in the Stephen Davies. And Bloom, we know, is a very cultured individual. And not only does he morally eat, but he's involved in an artistic and literary profession, advertising. And he also, we learn in chapter 10, knows quite a bit from Linehan, knows quite a bit about astronomy as well. And so he not to mention what he thinks about gravity and what is it, 3.4 or 9.8 meters per second squared, and its speed, but also displacement, and the principle of Archimedes' displacement earlier, which he tried to remember but couldn't quite get the equation for. But one might imagine that Bloom would produce and raise a fairly cultured, artistic, and intelligent young man. And so Stephen here may very well fit the bill. And Bloom, as himself a cultivated and cultured older man, may fit the bill for what Stephen considers something like a father better than his own father, with his drunkenness, his inability to pay his debts, and his general failure to make something of himself by Bloom's own interpretation of Simon Saturn. And so Stephen seeks the life of Shakespeare in all his works, and you will have noticed many of the works are mentioned throughout this chapter. Perhaps a recommendation to read them all, though Stephen himself has not read them all. But according to Stephen, Shakespeare's early poem, Venus and Adonis, tells us in disguised form the story of how Shakespeare married Anne Hathaway. My goodness. The poem tells how Venus, goddess of love, falls in love with the handsome Adonis. And when he insists on going hunting against her will and advice, he is gored by a boar and dies. Stephen argues that the 26-year-old Anne seduced the 18-year-old Shakespeare, and thus unmanned him, leaving him sexually gored like Adonis. He makes this point in spite of the fact that Shakespeare supposedly had a vigorous, active sex life and could still be outraged by threats to the fidelity of his wife, just like Ulysses himself lays with Circe, Calypso, and sort of seduces, at least flirts with, to a strong degree, so much that she considers marrying him, Nausicaa, on the island of Scheria of the Phaeacians. And so this Shakespeare is sounding a lot like Ulysses, and his plays reflect his suspicion of that fidelity is the last that Stephen will make. So like Ulysses, Shakespeare dallied with other women during his long absence from his wife, 20 years as well, just like Ulysses. Like Ulysses, he seemed to distrust his wife, and the evidence for this is that he left her his second best bed in his will. It's a very famous fact. He used the names of his brothers, Richmond and Edmund, for two of his worst villains. Richard III, of course, is a profound play about murdering one's own family for power. And Edmund, alongside Edgar and King Lear, tries to supplant his half brother and take what is rightfully his from him. Old King Hamlet, of course, suspected one or both of his brothers of seducing his wife, obviously correct when it comes to Claudius. Hence, Stephen finds in all of Shakespeare's work the themes of usurpation and banishment. So in the same way that Hamlet is recalled from something of a banishment from his university, and he finds his throne, what should rightfully be his throne, usurped by King Claudius in the wake of his father's death. So does Stephen continue to find these themes in literature. And you will recall the last word of the first chapter, usurper. And so this, like the death of his mother, which itself connects to Hamlet because he sees her ghost over and over in the same way that Hamlet sees his father's ghost, is something that continues to return to in his thinking. This argument might be less interesting from a literary analytical point of view and more from a Freudian or psychoanalytic point of view, and that it is an argument that reveals just as much about the person making it, or perhaps more about the person making it than the person that he is arguing about. Similar to the point I made earlier about the projection of Buck Mulligan onto Leopold Bloom. Well, let's conclude with chapter 10 now. Chapter 10 is called Wandering Rocks, and it is at 3 p.m. 3 p.m. 1 hour before Blaze's boiling. Makes it Molly. In fact, we see him again in this chapter. This chapter is called Wandering Rocks because it features 19 different sections. And though it seems like a mess of machinery and random chaotic movement among Dubliners, it does feature the personalities of Bloom and Stevens strongly, even in absentia. Like, for example, when Linehan is talking about Bloom and a carriage ride that he once had with him and Molly, and he asked him about stars while all the while copying a feel. Molly, he was sitting next to her, and they were bumping up against each other, and he was enjoying this while Bloom was pontificating on the nature of the stars and which constellations were above them. But let me read the first lines from this chapter. The Superior, the Very Reverend John Conmee S.J., this means he's a Jesuit, Society of Jesus, reset his smooth watch in his interior pocket as he came down the presbytery steps 5 to 3. 5 to 3. Just nice time to walk to Artane. What was that boy's name again? Dignam. Thinking about Paddy Dignam. Yes, very Dignam at Euston Est. Yes, it is worthy, and it is verily worthy and just is what that Latin means. Or it is, yes, it is really just and worthy. Interesting thought to come into his mind. Jesuit, of course. Brother Swan was the person to see. Mr. Cunningham's letter. So apparently Martin Cunningham has sent him a letter. Yes, oblige him if good, practical Catholic, useful at mission time. So the Wandering Rocks are mentioned in Homer's Odyssey, as I mentioned earlier. But Circe insisted that Odysseus try Scylla and Charybdis instead. The Wandering Rocks crush all who pass between them. And so in this chapter, which exists in Ulysses but does not exist in Homer's Odyssey, we see a whirlwind of action. Very similar to me, for those of you who will want to focus on modernism for your final essays, is this chapter and its manipulation of the novelistic form, like chapter 7, Aeolus. In the same way that Aeolus features 63 headlines that jump us in and out of the narrative and mess with the experience of the reader reading, so that we are at one time reading that which is like a newspaper, though we're obviously engaged in reading a novel, but it is taking on the form of a newspaper. So this novel plays with form, which is a modernist element of it. It is moving against conventional representations of form. For example, even what will seem conventional compared to it, like Don Quixote. Don Quixote might have interpolated novels in it, but it never has newspaper clippings. So of course the newspaper came after Don Quixote. In any case, this chapter, with its 19 sections following differing figures each time, seems to be like the modern state of being, modern state of being without a transcendent ideal holding all individuals together. And that is a part of this chapter, which starts with a religious figure and ends with a political figure. It can seem as if people are just moving around during their lives randomly, doing meaningless things over and over. This is, in fact, one of the great problems of modernism and that which is modern. If one discredits the religious ideal, the transcendent ideal, through the coming of empirical science, then what does one replace it with? Well, in this case, in this chapter, the thesis, the hypothesis seems to be that everything will seem random, but that if one looks very closely, scientifically, empirically, one can find a thread of meaning, like Ariadne's thread in the labyrinth of Daedalus, Stephen's namesake. And so this chapter looks pessimistic, cynical at the outset, but might have an underpinning idealism to it. And perhaps that is part of modernism as well, that something has been destroyed, the medieval and ancient ethos, and the pursuit of a transcendent God figure shared by all in a culture. There are still those who believe, who are believers, of course, and pursue such ideals. But culturally, there are many that do not now. And so what does one fill one's days with when not pursuing such an ideal? How does one act? And is there a way to find something to replace an ideal that is transcendent after it has disappeared from the world? That is, I think, something that is encountered and interrogated in this chapter. In any case, the chapter comprises 19 sections, as I said, each contemporaneously or simultaneously using the method of spatial form rather than chronological or temporal form, representing a different part of Dublin life. So all these characters going about their days, all at the same time, being represented one after another, however, in the literary form. Because how does one represent everybody all at once without, say, a television screen and 20 panels? But that would be basically what is happening in this chapter, though described in a literary way as opposed to a visual way. The city is officially supervised by the power of the church and state, like I said, the priests and the viceroy. And the chapter is bookended by sections telling the story of their two philanthropic journeys. But the chapter reveals how little sway over the city that they have. So we met John Conmee, Father Conmee, in the first paragraph and in section 1, and he travels from north central Dublin to the O'Brien Institute to find a place there for one of the sons of the late Paddy Dignam. So he, like Martin Cunningham, like Bloom, is trying to help this family in the wake of tragedy. In section 18, the viceroy, the man who embodies British power in Dublin, travels from the Viceregal Lodge to the southeast outskirts of Dublin to inaugurate the Mirrors Bazaar in aid of funds for the Mercer Hospital. So both are engaged in philanthropy and doing good for others. And yet we see from the meat of the chapter that their actions, though we do not find out from the chapter itself whether either of them are successful, have, for all their institutional glory, have a very small effect on the life of the characters. So that might be a thesis that one might maintain about modernism. The state and religion, traditional figures that orient and take the largest places in one's life, take on relatively small places in one's life. One might also want to interrogate whether the state, whether it is the fact that the state takes on a diminished value alongside religion, or whether it takes on an enlarged value as well. But at least in this chapter, it doesn't seem to take on the enlarged value through the figure of our viceroy. With no one person dominating the chapter, we seem to be living in a world, like I said earlier, driven by mindless machinery, stochastic, random, ungoverned by a transcendent ideal or a transcendently embodied figure like a god. And so what we need to interrogate, just to use my favorite word from the day, is whether this is in fact the case or whether this is simply what is apparent. And so one part of the thread of Ariadne that I might mention here for those who wish to take the latter view, that this is but an apparent stochastic machinery, random machinery, but that there is a thread of something more underlying it, is Lenehan's story of the knight riding in the cart with Bloom and Molly. Touching Molly and learning about the stars from Bloom, he still thinks that Bloom is a cultured man. What we learn about Bloom in this chapter from himself and from others undergirds his character, which is itself a constant throughout this story. Even if everything in the world seems stochastic, random, ungoverned by ideals, Bloom seems to be governed by an ideal. Like I said earlier, that a Platonic form only exists in this reality rather than the world of the forms by being embodied by an individual, so does Bloom bring some level of consistency to this story, that in the seeming random morass of detail, Bloom is capable of bringing something into the world that has great value, and it's represented as having great value by having some sort of value that is attractive to Stephen. These characters have something attractive in each other, to each other, and they consistently manifest that which is part of their beings, and so calls out to each other, but also the characters around them, those characters at least that are capable of seeing Stephen for more than he is, or for more than they see him currently, as somebody not even worth going to a literary party. And of course, Bloom, those see him as somebody who's and not self-seeking, and not just the denigrating aspects of his identity that are culturally stereotyped by these Dubliners. And so we also learn a little bit about Boyle in this chapter as well. Just as Bloom, but this again offers a foil to Bloom. Boylan is buying fruits to share with Molly as something of an aphrodisiac, or a bit of part of the foreplay before consummating his relationship with her. Bloom, we know, has bought her a book called The Sweets of Sin, or Sweets of Sin. This again is a slightly more intellectual, cultured, abstracted version of what Boylan is going to provide, right? He will provide for her sensual pleasure by giving her fruit, and by also offering her what might be considered the allegorical interpretation of eating of the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil. There are some allegorical interpretations that Adam and Eve did not eat fruit, but in fact copulated, and due to copulating, experienced that which would bring about reproduction, and thus came to understand that they were mortal because of this reproductive function, which is an interesting idea, but just want to admit, of course. So Boylan is going to literally, physically satisfy Molly's desires, whereas Bloom attempts to satisfy her desires through giving her literature, which is more abstract, like we talked about with his relationship with Martha Clifford. He is not physically consummating his relationship with her. He's intellectually, literarily mitigating this relationship in the same way that he is not physically consummating his relationship with Molly. He is trying to literarily consummate. He's still providing for her in a way, but he's not providing for her what she wants. And what she wants is real physical contact. And so Bloom, in his own artistic, cultured way, attempts to give her what she wants, even though he can't stand the notion of lying with her after Rudy died, and him being responsible for that. And what's perhaps lurking in the back of his head is him being responsible for that again. And could he bear to have a second son die on him, and have the weight of that weigh on him so heavily alongside the weight of his first son, and of course his father, the suicide, who comes up in his mind over and over again. Stephen too encounters a foil for himself, his young sister Dilly, whom we saw earlier, that Bloom had observed and thought must have been selling furniture in order to get money for the family in the wake of their mother's death, and Simon's inability to bring home the bacon, as it were, like Bloom did all the way back in the first chapter. Dilly is looking at French primers, and is going to buy a French language primer so that she can learn French like her intelligent brother Stephen. And he himself encounters some interesting, uncomfortable feelings in relation to this. On the one hand, he wants to encourage his sister, or at least not discourage her, but he also looks down into her eyes and realizes that she, like the man that he wondered whether he would save, and like the man whose body showed up on the shore of Dublin, and like the dog that had also drowned that was on Sandy Mount Strand, the ideas of drowning again come up to him, and he thinks that she is drowning, as if she is part of a declining family, a family that is not going to make it, and that she perhaps is not going to make it. And I think in the 21st century in America, we often think that this might be sort of a denigration of her intellect, that he thinks that she might not make it through school. I think it's much deeper than that, that he may very well think that she will not make it through childhood, because Stephen has made it through his childhood, now has a job, can support himself, even though he's not doing that which is necessary, knows several languages. He has the abilities he needs to do what he needs to do. Dilly does not yet have these abilities, even though it looks like she has a similar intellectual spark to Stephen. Her family is not going to have the same money with the 15 children it has now, and I believe 14 still at home, Stephen now being gone. They're not going to have the means to educate Dilly in the same way as Stephen was educated, and perhaps not even, it's tough to say whether they will even have the means to support themselves. And they are in a very dark, difficult situation. And so we see here Stephen morally, aesthetically struggling with the notion that his sister, whom he seems to have some affection for, is showing sparks of talent and a desire to be more than she is, and yet he, not knowing the power of his swimming, either physically or psychologically, doesn't know whether he can help this girl that is part of a drowning family. And it might even be something of an aesthetic, or the sort of thought that one has who is an artist in the family, that he must to some extent sacrifice the family for the art, that he cannot let the aspirations or the responsibilities that he has for the aspirations of his family members keep him from his own aspirations, because he may be the only person that can do what he does, and that may be a very heavy weight that he carries. Well, in any case, we are now to 3 p.m. We've talked about chapters 9 and 10, and we will soon come to the conclusion of Ulysses.